Thank you very much indeed for coming to this session. I just want to say thank you ever such a lot to ASA for inviting me here and for their amazing hospitality over the last couple of days. It's been fantastic. And it's been a real privilege to be in Yerevan. You're all very lucky people if this is where you live. Okay, so I think my job today was to try to make data interesting, which I might not be able to do, but at least I'm hoping I'm going to convince you that data matters, okay? So it may be a big claim, and you may not believe that it's going to make the world a better place, but in some ways, I think this is about why and how good audience data can make the world a better place. So we've got about half an hour, and I was going to talk a little bit after we've had some introductions about why data matters and my particular interest in audience and participation data, as you've just heard from the last session. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our work at the Audience Agency, and then to talk very briefly about data for policy and how we using those data sets for policy making. And then I'm going to think a little bit about how organisations are using audience data in very creative ways to develop themselves as organisations and artists. And then finally, if we have time, I might talk a little bit about data to predict change, but we'll stop if it's all getting a bit boring. Okay, so let's have a quick look. Let's do some introductions, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask you to introduce yourselves first, okay? So can I ask you, who has got a phone? Do you have a phone with you? Right. Can you see that barcode? There you go. So if you would like, could you point your phone at the Menti barcode there, and let's at least see if we can get into it. It's a good start. Would you please like to tell me which of those categories most says what you do? So it doesn't matter if it's not exactly right, but which one of those things explains your job? Are you an artist? Are you a cultural manager or producer? Are you an academic? Are you a policymaker or funder, and something in between? Or are you something completely different from those things? Now, I know that lots of you are all of those things, or occasionally have been those things, but which is the best description of who you are now? So for those of you who are data-tastic, you'll notice that we're now segmenting my audience. This is very exciting because live, I'm getting some nice data about who you are that's going to help me think about what I'm going to say next. So that's the general idea of this bit. So there we go. That was the first question. Has everybody had a chance to do that? Let's go back. So we've got quite a nice mix. So I'm going to use you as our sample, folks, if you've done it already. Would you describe yourself as a data hater, a data skeptic, a data enthusiast, or you're not sure? What I really love about Mentimeter is that it's segmenting your answers as we go. So it's telling me which of you feel differently about these things. So look at that. We know that policymakers and funders are a bit more enthusiastic at the moment about data than, say, or others. So quite interesting thoughts about this. So one data hater. One artist data hater. You are completely anonymous. Don't worry. We'll never know who you are unless you choose to declare yourself. So interestingly, I'm surprised by how many data enthusiasts there are. You will have gathered that I do this quite often. And actually, I think this may well be the highest score of data enthusiasts I've seen. So I think that ASA have prepared the ground well for this section. Phew, I'm feeling a bit less nervous now about talking about data. Fantastic. Right, let's move on to the next question. What kinds of data do you use in your work? It's quite small, but you should be able to see it on the screen. It says audience data or feedback, data about events and venues, financial data, data about jobs and employment, data about resources, funding partnerships, or other kinds of data. Well, I can see there are actually now 49 people in here, so I need to wait a bit longer to get everybody to vote. That's kind of interesting. So, data about resources and funding, no surprise there. There you go. Quite a lot of audience data users, good to see. So how far do you agree with each of these statements? Let's go for this. So the first one, there is no place for data in the arts and cultural sector. Data should inform all our decisions. Data kills creativity. There is a place for data. You just need to ask to talk to people too. Quality of data is more powerful and meaningful than quantitative data. This is quite a tough one. You have to think quite hard about this one, I think, quickly. I'm interested in this bottom one. I can't resist using it because I do find a lot of my colleagues in the cultural sector, particularly in the UK, particularly lots of people working in cultural organisations, are always quite worried about quantitative data. And there's this kind of instinct that qualitative data is just better, it's more fair, it's more just. And I think I don't have time to debate this a lot from the stage today, but I would love to discuss it more with you, just to say that I think that quantitative data can be as democratizing and empowering as qualitative data can be. It just depends what the job at hand is. And I would like us as a cultural sector to lose our bias against quantitative data, although I see this is quite a measured response. Again, sometimes I'll talk to people and it's right off the scale, people saying they definitely strongly agree that it's more powerful and better. I think that's leading the way. The one that resonates most is that there's a place for data, but sometimes you just need to talk to people. I think that's the one I feel strongest about as well. Okay, next one. Which one best describes your view of AI? I suppose the point about including this question is to say bad AI is based on bad data. So if we as a sector don't have good data, we will be trampled by the AI machine. And I think, when we talk about the arguments, the policy arguments of having good data, I think there's a really strong one to say if we want to be visible in the world and we want to tell our story in the right way, AI will be doing it for us. And if we put bad data or no data, the data that we don't want in there, it will have terrible consequences for us in the future as well. So thank you very, very much for introducing yourselves to me. Now I want to introduce myself. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more to you. So I've already talked a bit about my organisation and so on, but I also want to just explain something. This mug does not belong to me. Okay, I just want to make it quite clear that I am not particularly a lover of data on its own. I'm not a data geek. I don't come from a data geek background, and I'm not really that interested in fiddling around with data. So just to be clear, when I'm talking about data mattering, I don't mean in the geeky sense, and I don't really believe that data on its own matters. What do we actually mean when we're talking about data? I guess we're talking about facts. Very straightforward facts. Ideally, the sort of thing that is not a question of opinion, but is a matter of fact. Of course, collecting opinions can be facts in themselves, but metrics, observations, feedback, but all collected in a way that can be organized and analyzed. And that's what we mean by data. It's the facts, it's the metrics, it's the observations, it's little bits of parcels of signals, if you like, that you can collect. But they don't really have meaning on their own. And I guess I'm sort of much more interested in this rather famous pyramid. I'm sure, I know there are lots of data enthusiasts here, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with this pyramid. So that really has this suggestion that data is only as useful as what you can do with it, and you do need to transform it to make it into true, meaningful knowledge, and ideally even wisdom. And I suppose in our sector, that often looks like this. This is quite contested, the different stages of this model. Lots of people disagree about what you mean at each stage, but broadly speaking, we think about it as being, at the next stage, you turn data into information by organising it, structuring it, and analysing it. In our world, that often looks like the report that has the insights in it. The knowledge part is really about taking a decision or making an action on the basis of that data. And of course, already at this point, we're now using our interpretive skills. All sorts of biases can creep into the picture at this point, but essentially, this is the bit where it gets interesting. When we're turning the data, it's now become information. And now we're thinking, what does it mean? What do we do with it? How do we apply it? And of course, this is not an entirely scientific effort. It requires imagination, it requires openness of mind, and I think at best it requires an experimental kind of mindset where you think, well, it might mean this, let's try this, what does it mean? Let's test it. So we're also thinking, finally, when I think about learning, I'm often thinking about we've taken this data, we've done something with it, we've tried something out, we've tried a policy, we tried a new practice thing. Did it work? What did we learn from it? What new questions do we have? I often think at the top of the pyramid is like taking what we've learned and moving forward with it. So I think then there's also this notion of reflection, reviewing what we've taken from the data and so on. So that's the bit for me at the top of the pyramid, which is really interesting. I think for most of us who are cultural leaders, that's the place that we should be interested in, the top of the pyramid. We shouldn't obsess too much about the data. It's about what we do with it, how we understand it, who gets to interpret it. We were talking about data as power. The question of who is the interpreter seems very interesting and useful to me. And of course, one of the other things we're doing is we're often taking bits of data that come from the past and trying to use them to think about what our future looks like. And again, this is all a bit speculative. We don't know for sure whether those things are doing it. But for me, when I talk about I'm not interested in data, the bit I heart is the bit at the top, basically. And I suspect that's the bit we're all interested in. But one of the other reasons I love data is that I think it really helps us fight off the hippos, right? So I think that data is an antidote to a hippo. So many of us have worked for many years in the cultural sector in which the most important data is the highest paid person in the organization's opinion. So there's the idea the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion, is very worrying for us, in as much as no data, you just kind of go with the kind of better or worse ideas of somebody who has in a position of power. And I think in the cultural sector, we've also tended to rely a bit on believing that truly creative people don't need data, that actually their instincts are so good that actually we don't have to rely on the data in any way. And so I think data is a little bit problematic in our sector. It was interesting looking at your responses to the Menti, because I think you're convinced that that's not the case. So I know I'm preaching to the converted here, which is very exciting. So I think that good data matters because it fills out gaps in our knowledge, of course. Making things measurable and comparable means we can prioritize them. We can put our efforts where they really matter. I think good data, most importantly perhaps, challenges our biases. You know, it makes us look at what we thought we already knew. It makes us think about whose voices we're listening to. And Marina introduced the idea that I definitely believe, which really good data is about democracy. I think that making room for the voices, views and needs of those people who are least heard is part of how we should be using data. Now, of course, it depends what data you choose to collect, but at its best, in our sector, we should be using it to make room for those voices. It helps us to tell our own stories with credibility. I think we have a really complex story to tell about cultural value. Cultural value is really difficult to explain, and I think having good data helps us to do that with some kind of credibility. It helps us to do what we do better. How is that landing? What are the things we do having the effects we really believe that they do? It helps us to measure this complex mix of cultural, economic and social value. To do this well, by the way, to really properly measure and articulate the value of culture, it's really important to have good audience data, good data about communities, good data about audiences. All those other bits and pieces don't really work unless you have the good audience data. If you want to generate ideas about cultural value, you have to know who is being affected and how. So this is why I've dedicated most of my working life to collecting data in such a way that we can use it for that. Of course, we know that it can unlock investment. And I think the thing that perhaps we don't think so much about is the idea that good data can also inspire us. It doesn't tell us what to do. It should be a source of inspiration and creativity. And I'm going to end my presentation just thinking about what that looks like. Our organisation, in a way, is a reflection of that triangle. So a lot of what we've been thinking about doing over the years is not just collecting data, to collect the important data that was missing, but then really importantly to think about what it means and to think about what it means for policy and practice in the cultural sector, to be that interlocutor between the two things. So the Audience Agency is all about sharing insight to help the cultural sector adapt, in our minds, for and with their communities. So it's a really important idea for us that ultimately all our work is about better representation of the public and more inclusive representation. As a model, in the UK, we think about ourselves as being a charity. That's our constitutional statement. That essentially means that we're an NGO. We're a non-profit, and that to me is very important because we're quite mission-driven. It's not really, we're not a research agency in the traditional sense. It's very much about, we do a lot of funded projects for a good reason. But we do also we have to earn money from organisations because it's the only way we can keep our business model going. We like to think of ourselves as a research, do, learn agency. That triangle It's kind of part of that idea, if you like. Research, do and learn. So we're not pure academic researchers. We're very, very applied. We're always thinking about the practical applications of any research that we do. And we're always thinking about moving on to the next step. We're quite interested in helping using data to help organisations to do things differently. There's about 50 of us, actually. We're quite a big organisation for something like this. So we're a real mix, as I was saying, of data specialists, data analysts, researchers, and then lots of people that come from the cultural sector, including people who are real specialists in co-creative practices, have come from NGOs themselves, or have worked in large institutions. And this mix of all our different skills is what I think makes what we do really special. So we mix together quantitative data, and then we do a lot of action research whenever we can persuade anybody to finance doing it. So actually trying things out in the field and finding out whether the data led us to the right conclusions or not. And we work with really hundreds of different kinds of cultural organisations and museums, very broad in our reading of the cultural sector, but only the cultural sector. We work with a lot of local authorities, the culture teams there, but also with other funders and so on. And our idea is always based on what happens if we share data, what happens if we share learning. That's at the core of our model. So these are roughly the areas we do things in. Our core thing that we were always about that, and we started with, was thinking about audience development and participation. But we also do a lot of work around digital transformation, creative places, which is our version of decentralization. We have a decentralization team, essentially, which is thinking much more about how we do bottom-up ecosystem building in different regions around the country, evaluation and impact, and then creative economy, which is our work really at that sort of national or regional policy level. So those are the things we do as an organisation, but the data is sitting there underneath it all the time. The tools that we offer people are essentially something we call audience answers, which I'll come on and talk a little bit about in a moment, which is essentially taking the data from lots of organisations, putting it all together and finding out what it tells us. So sharing data and insight across the whole sector, your data next to somebody else's, how does it compare, etc. Audience spectrum, where that helps us to share insight about people and places, because we take the data and then we model it onto the population so we can see where those gaps are. I'll show you more about that in a moment. And we also do a lot of work around peer learning and action research. So I was saying, I'm not going to talk very much about that today, but we do a lot of work just working with organisations to see how they can make change using that information. So we have 3 data sets that are just ours. We work with lots of other secondary data, but we have 3 data sets that we, when I say ours, they actually belong to the whole sector because they've all contributed in one way or another, but the ones that we use all the time. So the first one is a pot of national audience data, which comes from, it's about 1,200 organisations have at some point put information into that data, so that data set. So they either put it in from a survey or they put it in from ticketing. So it makes this large data set about the audiences of cultural organisations. Audience spectrum, as I've said, which is about different audience profiles around the country. And then we also then just add to all of that, triangulate some of that information by doing a regular population study. Let's have a quick look at those things. So audience answers, you can go onto audience answers and there's lots of free information that anybody can access for the sector. But there are also some free tools. In Scotland and Wales, the Arts Council of Scotland and Wales pay for their funded organisations to take part. And in England, people can take part off their own bat if they want to. So in England, this was originally funded by the Arts Council, but now they expect the organisations to pay for it themselves. So there are lots of tools. You can join. Some of the tools are completely free, and there are various levels of subscription. You can find out more about your audiences. But it's really about trying to get the most out of the data that you have, and lots of advice about what it means and how to use it. So we have a big pot of data, essentially, a digital, a highly technically oriented pot of data, and essentially into it we put post-visit survey data. So everybody does the same audience survey and they put it into the pot. We put in some ticketing data, which is extracted from the ticketing systems of lots of different organisations. About 500 organisations put ticketing data in. And then we add in lots of information about art form and venue. So we put lots of information into the data so we can see what kind of events people were going to. We add in our audience spectrum profiles, what kind of people like what kinds of things and so on, and addressed information. And then what we do is we put in some maps, we mix it all up, and then it comes out in the form of organisations can have a dashboard, they can see their data as it sits. I mean, it's data that comes from them, but we've added in lots of new information for them. It gives us some really good national and regional data sets that we can do things with, the kinds of things we were talking about with Marina. And then we just do lots of asking questions of the data. What did we find out about this? How do we know if that? So we just use it like a crystal ball as well, sometimes, that we just could look into and see what's going on. But really importantly, we also offer a lot of support with that. So what we've realised is that people who work in smallish NGOs and even largish national cultural institutions don't have a lot of time to do this. So we often are trying to minimise the impact on them and trying to get them the information they need as quickly as possible. So we're often just spitting out reports that are helpful, trying to automate some of that process. And of course, we've now putting AI into quite a lot of our tools in a very responsible, ethical way, helping again to make it all quicker and easier for people. So that's the mechanics of audience answers. As I say, we also then kind of add in new data. We try and keep that data up to date, and we try and add in a qualitative aspect by doing a little population study usually twice a year, where we go and ask people about quick indicators. How do you feel about when we had a big cost of living crisis? We asked people about how they were responding to ticket prices, for example. And we can test out lots of things there, looking at current issues. Often people ask us to put questions in there. We're often working with a partner who helps us to understand what's going on. But this is helping us to understand what's happening right now and applying that to the data. So those are our three different data sets. I said I was going to talk a little bit about audience spectrum. And audience spectrum is kind of important because this is the project that we're hoping we can do something a bit like this with ASA, which would be amazing if we can pull this off and do something a little bit like this in Armenia. This is basically a segmentation of the whole population of the UK. So we look at the data that we hold and we can see that around the country, you've got different ways of interacting with the arts. We can look at the data and we can split them into it's 10 top segments, then 20 sub-segments, 20 different ways of engaging with the arts and culture. So we do the segmentation based on people's attitudes towards culture. We then model that data onto a database of all 28 million households in the UK. So we can tell from where someone lives which profile they're most likely to have, and that helps us to locate and to see where people are and are not excluded and so on. We then can also put that information into the database of cultural organisations so they can see what kinds of audiences they already have. And then I forgot to put, there's a nice free map that you can go and have a look at. So you can also look at a map of the UK and see what kinds of people are living where, what kind of community are you in the middle of. We do try to think really carefully about this not being a tool to help you get more rich people who want to do more arts and culture. It may be that that's what some organisations need to do sometimes. It's also very much about including people who are not currently included, and we try to be quite ethical about the way in which we talk about them, the way we actually do the data, and certainly now the way we're thinking about using AI. But you can see there are all sorts of potential challenges about using segmentation data in terms of including people or excluding them. So we try to make it a really responsible and ethical approach to it. What comes out of that, as I said, we have our 10 lovely segments. They're all broken into two, in fact. We have sort of a group of what we would call highly engaged arts attenders, people who are really interested in the arts and culture, and they think about themselves as being part of their identity, if you like. We have a medium engaged group, people who do regularly attend the arts, but they don't necessarily, they're not perhaps as adventurous in their tastes, and they don't go quite as often, partly because of where they live. They're a little bit less close to the cultural infrastructure. They don't have as many opportunities. But again, some differences between age group and lifestyle a little bit, all sorts of markers that tend to suggest that we now have, we first clustered this on what people actually did, but then we learned a lot about who those people were at the second stage. And then we have a group of people who, I wouldn't say that they don't do arts and culture, they definitely do, but not necessarily in cultural institutions. So those people are all sorts of people we've been talking about today who really do lots of stuff in their own communities. They're as cultural as anybody else, but they don't appear as much in cultural institutions. They don't necessarily have as many resources. And so actually that's a group that we're often thinking about, how do we kind of find better ways of engaging with them, those less arts engaged groups. So there we go. We do that in the data. It sits in lots of databases that you can access in different ways, including putting it into your own database. If you have a CRM system, you can put it in there. But we also look at it from a national point of view. And then we provide lots of materials. You can't read those things, but you can go and have a look online. We do guides, and there's information and charts and graphs, lots of things about how to engage those groups and so on. And if you really need to, you can phone my colleague Megan, and she'll talk you through how to look at some of that data. So there's quite a lot about, it's not really just about doing the segmentation. There's a lot about making sure that people can actually use it. So those are our data sets, and those are the things that we use. But we use them, as I say, in this kind of influencing what's happening at policy level, as well as thinking about how people are using it in organisations. So right from the grassroots, really small organisations, it's often the best data they have. It's sometimes the only research that they can afford, or they don't have to afford it, it's free. But also we are using it with national government as well. So when we think about policy making a difference at the policy level, I guess at national policy, we're often thinking about, we've done several recently art form reviews. We've used it in a review of the opera sector. We've used it in a review of touring, taking work around the country. So we're often using it to understand the state of something, and then to design what comes next, I guess. We have used it a lot for decentralisation. We've used it a lot to think about where you might want to put what kind of culture, not usually as the only source of information, but often as a good starting point. And similarly with building like feasibility studies. So for example, we've done a lot of feasibility studies for new buildings or new infrastructure. We've used this as an important, that doesn't quite exist, nothing else exists like this does to do that. And we've done a lot of work around funding streams. I'm going to give you a little example in a moment. And really we've used it with a lot of our local municipalities, with the municipalities who are building their own cultural strategies, not quite as beautifully as in Sweden, but many of them do have their own cultural plan, and 75 out of 300 of them use this data in some way to do that, and it's growing all the time. Very much about, again, as I was saying earlier on, setting the baselines, thinking about the design, and then thinking about how to evaluate what you've done. So lots of those sorts of things. I'm going to give you a very quick example about a very lovely program called Creative People and Places. It was a small pilot done by our Arts Council about a decade ago. They started work on this. And they said, if we could make a small amount of money available to the community organisations in a particular place that has low levels of engagement, it can't go to institutions, it must be the community, and the community will have control over that money. And the only rule we're going to say is that the community must be involved with choosing what activities will happen. So I think there were about 20 of them, 10 places in the first place did this. And the results were pretty remarkable. And it was the first time really ever that we noticed that an Arts Council funding programme had the desired effect to actually democratise any kind of culture before. They spent millions of pounds on programmes in the past, and none of them have worked. It was the first time we could see something really interesting was happening. But we used the data to actually prove it, and I'll show you how we did that. So essentially, we used those audience spectrum profiles. We collected postcode data, and then we could profile the postcode data to show us exactly what kinds of people were engaging with the programme. And importantly, if you look at this, the dark bar on the charts, that's how the population breaks down for mainstream arts. If you look at all the arts organisations funded by the Arts Council, and you aggregate all of them, you can see that 14% of them are in this kind of mainstream arts group here, 23% dormitory Penrose and so on, but you're getting much lower representation in these blue, less engaged groups. But you can see that the Creative Places and People and Places programme are the light bars, and they totally reversed the trend. It just turned it on its head. Now, we all knew something was interesting was happening. The Arts Council knew something was interesting was happening, but we couldn't quite see the scale of the impact. And this time we could actually prove it quantitatively. And I think on the basis of this and other things, but they managed to go from what was originally a £10 million pilot programme to it's now £120 million. And actually the whole programme has massively influenced how we think about it massively influenced the Arts Council's 10-year strategy that came after that. So you can see it's a pretty simple piece of data, but it shows so clearly the difference at scale and in an unequivocal way that you could actually compare mainstream arts, what was happening in the core funded organisations with this new programme. So it's just I think it's just a very nice, simple example of how we can use that stuff. As I say, there's a lot we can do using this data to help us think about audiences. Where's my potential audience? How do I evaluate my audience? You can hear that this data is going to be super useful to anyone thinking about audiences. But over the years, we've become more and more convinced that we need to do more than just a bit of evaluation, a bit of planning. We really needed a process that showed how you use this data in an intelligent and creative way. So we've been working on a model that helps us to think about taking the data we have about audiences and communities and using it to really build empathy. How do we kind of take it as the base, as the starting point, but then encourage organisations to actually talk to their audiences and communities, to use the data to help them to creatively rethink what they do, to prototype and test new things, new ways of doing things, but use the data to help them understand whether it's working or not. And then finally, too, with some confidence, make pretty major changes in the way that they're working on things and keep going around a cycle. So we've been developing this using Audience Spectrum as one of the core tools. We've been basically working on this cycle that does essentially that. Takes us through these sort of 4 stages: discover what's going on, what's the potential, what do people really need for us, what's most important at the define stage, moving into developing new ideas, new ways of doing things, and then finally delivering on plans where we can actually afford to take some risks because we've got some good data to help us to do that. So this is a slightly new way of thinking about how we do audience development using data all the way through the process. For those of you who are audience development interested, we're just working on a new playbook. It's coming soon. You can have a look at that and how that works. I'm going to show you, just to end really, a quick case study about a theatre that we were working with on a European programme several years ago where we were kind of developing this thinking. And I want to just do a quick demonstration really about how you can use data to make really great ideas. So they had some audience research, the pretty usual kind of audience research we did. It was research about barriers. It was very stuff that we look at all the time, thought all familiar. It said things like the usual confusing information where people say, well, why didn't you come to the theatre? Well, the weather wasn't very good. The weather was too nice. You get both of those things, of course. You get things like, don't know where to buy tickets, don't know where to park, it's too expensive. All things they felt they could do something about. Then there were a couple of really interesting things in there. There was this really interesting one about having a boring husband, which they thought, oh, what's this boring husband thing about? And then they had this other thing about no one to go with. So they took this little piece of insight and thought, what can we do with this boring husband problem that somebody has? So lots of stuff. So what they did this process about thinking to do with, okay, we've got an issue, this issue of people having no one to go with. And so they did a lot of talking to people and building up some empathy. And they came up with this idea of an idealized person called Charlotte based on their conversations. She's an older part-time librarian. She loves the theatre, but guess what? Her boring husband doesn't. So she likes going, she doesn't have anyone to go with. What could they do about Charlotte? Over time, they developed something rather brilliant called datasets, which I will explain what that means in English in a moment. They developed a completely new way of thinking about how they were going to offer theatre up to Charlotte. So essentially, the datasets means the good company. And it's for you if you don't always have someone to come to the theatre with. They started off thinking that it was going to be like a singles night. And they realised that Charlotte she got a husband, he was boring, but she didn't want another one. So they stopped, it's not a singles night, it's not for that. And they changed the name, they called it the Thursday Club because that was the day they decided to give away tickets. And of course, nobody knew what the Thursday Club was. They tried to charge extra money for it because they thought it might be a money maker, which went down really badly. So they changed all of that and said, okay, what we really understand is that people just want a nice, low-key social environment. They don't want to have to pay premium for it and so on. So they adapted, they kept trying out little prototype versions of it over time. And they came up with this amazing club, which is, I think there are about 300 members of it now. It was something that has nurtured the theatre for a long time. Those 300 people are incredibly loyal supporters. They sell a lot of tickets to them. They are ambassadors. They're also the core of the volunteer programme now. So they took a little bit of data and they used it really sensitively. They pushed it up that triangle in a really sensitive way, using prototypes and having an open mind about what you were learning all the time. So really working in what we might think as being a wise way. The really lovely bit of this story was it wasn't just Charlotte. It wasn't just the good company they developed. They actually developed 10 completely new formats that help them as a theatre to re-engage with their local community. All sorts of things here, including things like doing after-work singing. Apparently, I know this from Swedes here, but I don't know if the Danes are particularly famous for liking singing. I don't know if that's true for everybody, but apparently community singing is big in Denmark, but there aren't that many places you can go to do it. They thought, well, we know musicians, we've got space, we can just make some community singing opportunities. So they do the after-work sing for adults, a kind of Saturday morning sing for families. They did something where they talked to young people who were saying, why don't you want to come and work in why do you want to come and engage with our theatre? And they said, well, it's just not really relevant to us. We're sort of worried about things like climate change. They thought, well, okay, why don't we just have a club where we talk about climate change? And that's worked really well for them. So all these formats came from a little bit of research, which was explaining a little bit of data about why people weren't engaging with things, but a little bit of data that come from the numbers that went to the quality, and then they prototyped all of these ideas. So I think this is a brilliant demonstration of how you can use data as a way of inspiring you to do new things in good ways. So if you've still got some ideas about research things that you're interested in, you'd like to know about, I think you can still put them into the Menti. Meanwhile, I'm just going, oh, look, I can see them. Well, look at that, fantastic. So we were interested in the patterns, users' patterns of behaviour, diagnostic approach to work, numbers of art workers per industry, data on organisations, qualitative and quantitative research on cultural organisations, their needs and assumptions, very interesting. Needs assessments and open databases, don't get me started, come and see me later. What are audiences' needs and how can I help? Great question. What kinds of skills and arts practices are higher education art students interested in? So exactly like that climate riddle problem that we just talked about there. Some really good things here. I can't scroll, I don't think, but I'm going to save these for our ASA colleagues. I'm just going to say thank you very much for after a long session already, and in between you and your lunch, just to say thank you very much for listening, and please come and talk to me. It's been really nice to meet you. Thanks.